So we talk about global neurosurgery, right? So I'm now the co-chair of the Global Neurosurgery Committee, and we've kind of wordsmithed the definition so we can all agree on what we're talking about. And we came to this definition. It is the clinical, and we're all familiar with the clinical practice, and the public health practice of neurosurgery. We're really introducing the population, the health system aspect of practice of neurosurgery. And the purpose is to ensure timely, so it's about access, safe, quality surgery, and affordable. It's really about equity, making sure that everybody has access and to all who need it. And we want everybody to sort of use this definition from now on, because we've had multiple definitions going back and forth, but this is the one that's been agreed upon. This is a picture from the COSEXA exams. This was in Mozambique about 2 years ago. And I put this here because if you look at all the talks, with the exception of Marie's talk, we focused a lot on education and training. And that's not, it's not a surprise, because this is what we're used to. And this is a perfect example. And we have Mike Haglund, we have representatives from Norway, UK, US as examiners, and then we have some African examiners, right? And actually 2 of the Ethiopian examiners were my former residents, which I'm very happy to report. But education is one component of global neurosurgery. When I worked in Ethiopia, and I also worked in Cambodia, we just assume that the government or the health system will absorb these new trainees somehow. And we just take things as they're given, saying, well, there'll be a facility, maybe they'll have a CAT scan. If they don't, they'll make do with it. Maybe they'll have an ICU, maybe not. And it became clear to me that, can we change that? Do we have to accept status quo as sort of whatever the government's willing to give us, we'll take? And I would challenge you that we have an opportunity to actually engage in policy dialogue with ministries of health, like Bob has talked about, and then try to, so when we produce neurosurgeons, it's more of a push, and hopefully the neurosurgeons will go out and build surgical centers and then expand. But what if we can get the ministries of health to also prioritize surgical care and neurosurgical care, and then match our efforts with the government's efforts? It's a push and pull type of thing. And I will tell you, there has never been a time better than it is now to be engaging with policymakers, and I'll tell you all about it. And for me, it started with this report from the Lancet. I think Bob put this up. There was a Lancet Commission on Global Surgery. John Moore is my boss, Andy Leather, and Lars Hagender. And they looked at the current state of surgical care through the lens of equity, specifically at who's not getting surgical care globally. 5 billion people, 17 million do not have access, 17 million people may be dying every year as a result of inability to access these surgeries. They also came up with a number, 143 million operations currently not being done, and as a result, people are dying and people are getting disabled unnecessarily, and most of this is in the developing countries. And I don't know if some of the industry people are here or not, and I just do a simple arithmetic, 143 million operations that we're trying to get done over the next 10 years per year. This is every year. It's a massive market that will be created. If you just say $1,000 exchanges hands for every operation, potentially we're looking at a $143 billion market that is going to be created over the next 5-10 years, if we're successful. So I work at the Harvard Program in Global Surgery. I do some of the policy and advocacy work. I'm faculty there at Ben Wharf. I think someone mentioned him. He is my partner in this. And then we have a slew of people, that, including fellows and research associates. What we don't do is actual training in Maldives or Nepal, or we actually deliver surgical care. We don't do any of that. We specifically work at the policy level to trying to use global governance, research to drive and inform these policies to strengthen surgical care. And we train future leaders in global surgery, and specifically we have a global neurosurgery fellowship program. So what do countries do? How do ministries of health make plans? How do they prioritize health items? Everything is done under plans. They have a development plan, they have a health plan, and so we recognize that we have to convince ministries of health to develop a national surgical plan. And I will tell you this, so WHO has a program for surgical care. They work directly with member states, and Harvard Program in Global Surgery, we're the official collaborating center for surgical system strengthening. And we put on workshops for ministry people to come, and we help them with technical aspects of scaling of surgical care for the entire country. And you better believe it, for every one of these workshops, I'm talking about head injuries, spine injuries, and neurosurgical care. So what does this look like? We have, we engage with ministries of health, work with WHO, and then we also engage in discussions with major funders. For instance, World Bank, when Jim King was the president, he started a program for called Global Financing Facility. And specifically, they provide grants and loans for countries who will develop investment cases for expanding surgical care. And we've been doing these workshops and focused on Africa, Francophone Africa, and most recently in Asia. And right now, there are more than 44 countries, mostly developing countries, that have either started or are now doing facility assessments, are in the process of writing or completed their national surgical plans. We have reached beyond the tipping point. We have countries coming to us and saying, when are you going to help us? So there has never been a better time than to get ministries of health excited and convinced to implement surgical expansion in their countries. Let me just shift gears a little bit and talk about how global neurosurgery evolved. So I was now part of the program in global surgery, looking at global surgery as faculty, and then because at the WHO, the gentleman that they hired to implement a resolution for global scale-up of surgical care was Walter Johnson, and some of you may know he's a neurosurgeon. So we had an in with him. So it's me, Walter Johnson, and Bob Dempsey. Three of us wrote an article about global surgery, global neurosurgery, the unmet need, and that was in 2015. Walt invited some of us to come to WHO in Geneva, 2015, December. Gail was there. We talked about how do we what should be our strategy to move the global neurosurgical community to really embrace this issue of unmet needs. And we said, let's do a declaration in Bogota at the end of 2016, which we did. And before we did that, we met with the leaders of some of the key regional neurosurgical societies. And in December 2016, there was a declaration in Bogota at the neurotrauma meeting, ICRAN meeting, and Walter Johnson was there to accept the declaration. And we really call for a collective action among neurosurgeons around the world to address this unmet need issue. We should take ownership of this issue. And then we started to build momentum slowly. Some of you may remember the AANS meeting that Rick Boop was the president. The opening ceremony was all about global neurosurgery. Then the WFNS leadership started to buy into this whole process and said, let's go ahead and map and then do a study and try to figure out how many neurosurgeons that we have in the world as of 2016, 2017, which we did. And then there was a meeting in New York in January of 2019 that Roger Hartle put together at Cornell, and it was called Global Neurosurgery. And this is where Rich was there, and I was there, and I think he really saw what was happening, and then I think this is why we have today's topic. So we mentioned about the research output. In 2015, Bob, myself, and Walter Johnson wrote this paper. There's been an explosion in the research output, and if you do a PubMed search on global neurosurgery. And I think I want to make sure that we're not taking credit for all this. There was research being done, but we gave it a name. We put an umbrella to it, right? And everybody said, well, that's a perfect name for it because global surgery was a thing now. And it's been an explosion. This slide I was able to give to Jim Kim because he was invited to give the Cushing oration in the AANS meeting just last year. And he talked about global neurosurgery. So that was the slide before. Okay, so let me give you some specifics. When I got to Boston at the program in global surgery, we did the first, what we call baselining studies. We wanted to establish what is the current unmet neurosurgical needs, specifically in the developing countries. And we did a series of systematic reviews and then put them all together in a sort of a meta-analysis. And we came up with an estimate of 5 million neurosurgical operations. These are essential and neurosurgical operations. We actually had to take out disc herniations because when we added those in, it was more than the Lancet Commission's unmet number of 143 million. We exceeded the overall global estimates for essential surgical care, so we actually had to take that out. But anyway, it's 5 million. Most of it is in these red countries with red and yellow. And then in order to meet that demand, we estimate we need additional 23,000 additional neurosurgeons today. We need it now. So we did the baselining. And then we started to say, what's the next step? What do the policymakers really need? So we're telling the ministries of health, listen, you have a massive gap in your service in neurosurgical care. Well, what are you going to do about it? Well, they looked back to us and said, tell us how to help. You need to tell us. It's like, wow. This is where we needed to start thinking about how to advise ministries of health in a way that they understand. So they use things like health systems, building blocks of health systems. That's exactly what we did. And I think Bill pointed out more than almost half of unmet neurosurgical burden in developing countries is head trauma, right? TBIs. So we prioritized head injuries, and we added spine injuries as well. And then we created a matrix where we looked at the building blocks of the national surgical plans and health systems. This is infrastructure, workforce, service delivery, financing, governance, and information management. And we took the spectrum of care for TBI and TSI, including surveillance, prevention, pre-hospital care, surgical care, and rehabilitation. And you get this matrix, and then each matrix begs a research question. What are the key factors? What are the workforce requirements, for instance, for rehabilitation, if a country wants to prioritize head injury or spine injury? And we did a series of literature reviews, and we published this recently in World Neurosurgery. So some of the things that we came up with was that, they talk about golden hour for trauma surgery. We actually had data from Cambodia, head injury data, and we were able to show that after 4 hours, the Glasgow outcome scale deteriorates significantly. So we think we have as much as almost 4 hours before a person who has a head injury is brought to a facility capable of doing neurotrauma care. We're not saying you should take 4 hours, but that should be the upper limit. That gives tremendous flexibility to the ministries of health. Before, they say, well, do we need a center every 2 hours from each other? That's a lot of centers, but every 4 hours, it's a good place to start. We also know that if a place can do head trauma, eventually they'll be able to do discs, simple tumors, and maybe even vascular surgery. It's a way to get the foot in the door for neurosurgical services. And we also estimate at least one neurosurgeon to at least meet the trauma burden per every 200,000 people. And this is the kind of information that the ministries of health is looking for. So Rich mentioned that as of last September, October, I'm now the co-chair of the Global Neurosurgery Committee within the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies. And we have some members here. Bob is a member, Gail's a member of the committee. And there's been we're surgeons, we're clinicians, we immediately think that we're supposed to go and train people and deliver equipment and fix things. That's not what this committee is supposed to do. Now, some members of these committees do education, do actually these things, but the committee itself is tasked with coordination and alignment. And I like to make the analogy of a conductor that is able to say, well, the strings, we need more strings, but strings aren't playing very loudly, so we need a little more string. Or say we have a lot of activity from the horns, but we don't need that much right now. So if you look at the research output, we talked about the disparities about the origin of these research output, low income versus high income, but also looking at what this research is about. We need information with data collected from developing countries, talking about service delivery, we're talking about hospital delay times, those kinds of things. And we need to nudge the research output so that we have a balance. So we're actually going to start tracking research output, and this is not so much clinical research, but really about service delivery of neurosurgical care, workforce, infrastructure, those kinds of things. We're going to map it by regions and by themes. And so we'll be able to track where the gaps are, making sure that we are not missing some of these important research items. There's a massive amount of research that needs to be happening, and this is a really good time to be doing this kind of work. So the committee is really playing the role of a conductor. We're not the musicians. Musicians are already out there. There's people doing great work in education and training and even providing equipment. The WFNS Foundation does that. Our vision is universal access to neurosurgical care. There should be no reason why anyone in the world should have to die or become disabled because they can't access neurosurgical care. That's an aspirational vision. And our mission is to align and coordinate all global efforts to collectively address the unmet neurosurgical needs of our patients. So what does that look like? I'll give you an example. So we talked about access, right? 4 hours really. So we have objectives, and within each objectives we have targets. These are time-bound, attainable, and measurable. So for instance, we want to track global neurosurgical workforce. Well, we're already doing that at Harvard. Our team's doing that. And our target is to perform a 2020 survey. And then we also have another target is to establish an ongoing reporting mechanism so we can track it, right? What we don't measure, we don't really know. Another objective is to increase the number of training program. And we want to be able to, at least by 2021, have 3 new residency programs established, or at least initiated. These are local residency programs, like the one that Merlin Bagan started in Tribhuvan. I think now we know how to do it. Let's get 3 more started. And you may be wondering why 2021 is the target year. It's because the next World Congress of Neurological Surgery is in 2021 in Bogota. And it's exactly 5 years after the Bogota Declaration. And so we want to be able to come back and say, what happened after the declaration? And these are really low-lying fruits. These are not very big targets. I think these are attainable. And we want to at least get some quick wins. And then after this 2021, we may have a second set of objectives. So we want to initiate 3 new training programs. Equipment program. The WFNS Foundation is currently doing that, but we want to give them a target saying fill at least 75% of those requests. And we also want them to start tracking whether these equipments are still working and keep them accountable. And then we talked about affordability of neurosurgical procedures. We want to start tracking the out-of-pocket expenses that families, the patients' families, have to put out when they have to have emergency craniotomies, a CAT scan, or treatment for hydrocephalus. And really what it does is that it gives us information to go to ministries of health. For instance, in Cambodia, at the public hospital, all CAT scanners were private. That means they have to have money up front before they can get a CAT scan to get their surgery done at the public hospital. Well, other countries like Vietnam, CAT scans are subsidized. It's $20 a piece, right? So we're able to track this and then also use it as a way to pressure or nudge ministries in saying, your policies are not really helpful, or there are other ways you might want to consider doing that. So we really want to look at financial risk protection for neurosurgical procedures. And that's the amplify part of our objectives. We have 5 A's. And amplify access, align all global neurosurgical activity, advance relevant research. We talked about the mapping and the themes at the systems level. And it's important that we assimilate neurosurgical efforts within the global surgery efforts. We don't want to be sort of an outlier doing our own thing, have neurosurgical hospitals everywhere. We really want to be part of the overall global surgery movement. Nepal, just in 2 months, they're actually having a big launch. Nepal Ministry of Health, the UN, the Harvard Program in Global Surgery, we're coming together, and they're saying we're starting a process of developing a national strategic plan for surgical care, and Mohan Sharma will be part of that team, right? You can see how that happened, right? So it's all about making sure we're integrated within the overall global surgery movement. Remember, we talked about 44 countries. Our hope and one of our objectives is to make sure that neurosurgeons are involved in every one of those countries. And lastly, we want to advocate for neurosurgical care as for universal health coverage. I think it was Marie who talked about Sustainable Development Goals. SDG number 3 includes universal health coverage. And the WHO is singularly focused on this target. And we want to make sure that within UHC, neurosurgical care is included. So I'm going to finish off with the last 3 slides about spine care, because this is the Mazama Spine Summit. And I want you to see this box. This is the study that we did looking at these different buckets and different regions, and came up with the number of neurosurgical operations that are currently being done and not being done. And if you look at the volume of head injuries, it's over 6 million out of 13 million. But if you look at spine injuries, it's only 400,000 cases a year globally. This is our estimate. But if you look at the 2 boxes above it, I don't know, I have a mouse here, but the high-income country versus low-income country, it's almost a ratio of 9-to-1. 90% of spine fractures are happening in the developing world. And that's an important thing that we have to remember. And we have to also, what does that mean? I think what it means is we really can't take the latest generation of high-tech equipment next door and then transplant it in some place in Nepal or Maldives. I think we really have to think out of, fresh out of the box and saying, what do we need? How do we do it in an efficient and low cost and sustainable way? I mentioned that we did take out the degenerative spine surgeries because it was 266 million symptomatic degenerative spine diseases worldwide. If you say about half of them need an operation, that's 130 million. It's a lot. And we couldn't really argue that this was an essential or emergency operations, although there's a number, Cauda-Equina syndrome, for instance, or progressive neurological deficit, but we couldn't quite tease that out, so we just left it out just because we didn't want to be criticized as padding the numbers. But this is something that I think ultimately as spine surgeons we need to look at. But I don't think we should prioritize disc operations as our first foray into global neurosurgery for spine surgeons. I think it should be sort of the next stage. And then just some things to think about as for global spine surgery. We're not the only ones doing spine surgery. Orthopedic surgeons also do spine surgery. So how do we reach over to their communities and work on this together? Because I can't imagine it's just going to be an all neurosurgical effort. And then chiropractors, they have their own global spine care initiative going on as well. And then we talked about this essential versus, I don't want to say convenience, but I couldn't think of a better word. And we have to be very mindful that, we initially should start off with spine trauma because everybody agrees it's a high burden. We really need to operate on those cases and eventually move on to the other indications. And then once again, the private sector interest in spine care is, they're very it's weaved very closely together in the spine care. And how do you make sure that the needs of the people, the surgical equity, affordability, accessibility is assured. At the same time, bring in innovation and make sure that the industry is part of this expansion in market. right? So we need to have some discussions. There's clearly a shared value here. From our point of view, it's about surgical equity, but there's a market that's being created, and the industry should have a role in it, and they should be able to benefit as well. So that's all I have to share, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.